Hi. This video is the fifth one in a series I'm making on free speech. I'll put links to the previous 4 videos in this series in the description of this video. Anyhow, as I was making the last video in this series, the one on Jordan Peterson, it occurred to me that I was leaving out a pretty big piece of the puzzle. I've explored some of the underlying psychological reasons why we'd want to regulate, control, and enslave other people's speech in various ways, mostly to suit our own preferred ideological agendas. But I haven't really said much about the other side of the coin, that is, why we'd be so willing to accept the enslavement of our speech. Basically, the reasons why we put up with it. And that's what I'd like to focus on in this video. And I'd like to do that by looking at that puzzling phenomenon primarily from 3 interrelated points of view. First, that of the psychology of conformity and obedience, then that of existential philosophy, and finally, that of the psychology of addiction and addictive behaviors. But first, let me dilate upon the original question for a moment or two. So, how is it that so many of us are essentially indifferent to the ongoing enslavement of our speech and just passively accept all sorts of arbitrary linguistic prohibitions and dubious euphemisms and neologisms without really questioning it, and in the process incorporate their underlying ideological mandates and agendas into our everyday lives? In other words, how is it that so few of us are willing to question all of that, or even to notice that it's happening in the first place, much less to resist it? What are the primary psychological dynamics at play that would give rise to the kind of strange passive acquiescence that seems so common in our world? Perhaps the first answer to that question has to do with mindfulness. Probably many of us simply aren't aware that we're being drawn into the thrall of other people's ideological agendas when we obey their dictates about what speech we're allowed to use. In essence, part of the reason why we don't resist the enslavement of our speech is that we're not conscious of it. And more importantly, we're not conscious of the fact that we're being enslaved much more thoroughly than we would be by way of simple chattel slavery. That's because the enslavement of our speech is really an enslavement of our perception, our values, and our sense for what is real. Anyhow, since we're not really aware of it, we just go on with our lives, adapting the habits of our speech to whatever someone is deeming appropriate for us without ever questioning it, or realizing that we're losing part of our souls in the process. But beyond the issue of our conscious awareness, I suspect that the next piece of the puzzle has to do with the psychology of conformity and obedience. And probably the 2 most famous psychological studies in that area are Ash's study on social conformity and Milgram's study on obedience. I don't really want to get too bogged down in the details of those studies, which you can easily look up for yourselves. God bless the internet. So suffice it to say that what they have in common is that they illustrate just how powerful the dynamics of conformity and blind obedience are in our lives, even in cultures that pride themselves on individuality. In other words, it's not so much that conformity and obedience are weird anomalies in human affairs. On the contrary, they're what we're doing most of the time, most especially when we're unsure of ourselves and when there's no exemplars or role models for resisting them. As Eric Hoffer once eloquently crystallized it, when people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate each other. So, from this perspective, probably a lot of the ongoing enslavement of our speech has to do with the dynamics of simple conformity and obedience. In other words, since we're pretty much accustomed to conforming to the patterns of behavior of those around us, when it comes to speech, we tend to defer to the crowd, just like we do in many other areas of our lives. And the tendency to lose sight of our freedom of speech through simple conformity is only exacerbated by our willingness to submit to authorities of various sorts. In this case, to all of those self-appointed moral guardians who are always insisting on dictating what's appropriate with regard to everyone's linguistic practices. However, although simple conformity and obedience are powerful forces in our lives, and probably go a long way toward explaining the ongoing enslavement of everyone's speech in today's world, it seems to me that some of the deeper psychological insights in that area come from the existential analyses of Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Buber. Let's look at Heidegger first. By the way, I'll be pulling this somewhat liberally from his most famous work, Being in Time, 1927. Anyhow, in the first video in this series, I claimed that the freedom of free speech mainly has to do with the authenticity of our lives, which in a Heideggerian sense concerns what he calls our ownmost potentiality for being. In other words, whether we're moving toward those possibilities in our lives that are most genuinely our own, or whether we're simply deferring to what Heidegger calls the they, that is, to the habits of the anonymous crowd. I further claimed that consequently, what's really at stake in the issue of free speech is nothing less than our souls themselves, the very meaning and substance of our lives. However, for Heidegger, existing inauthentically is what we're doing most of the time. And what we need to do to live authentically is to, quote, choose ourselves, because inauthenticity is what we default to unless we take the special action of laying claim to authentic existence. In other words, if we never decide to move toward the possibilities that are most genuinely our own, if we never defiantly decide to lay claim to our own lives rather than the lives that someone else would have us live, well, then we'll simply continue to grind along inauthentically, robotically plodding along from one dull, uninspiring day to the next, never really living, never really daring to feel the swollen river of life coursing and surging through us moment by moment, raging like a relentless fever in our bloodstream, life pouring forth in all of its incomprehensible majesty, bold and brilliant like lightning in the midnight sky. We'll never really feel it. Not really. We'll simply remain nice, predictable, politically correct, never the creator, never the hunter, never risking ourselves enough to express what we really think and feel, but always remaining inoffensive, appropriate, always remaining more dead than alive. So the question is that really how we want to be in this world? Kind of makes you wonder a bit, doesn't it? However, it seems to me that Jean-Paul Sartre's analysis in Being in Nothing comes even closer to explaining why we so easily allow our speech to be enslaved. For Sartre, it's not merely an accident that we so often fail to lay claim to the freedom necessary to speak and live authentically. In fact, we actively evade and repress that kind of freedom, mostly by engaging in what Sartre calls bad faith. For Sartre, bad faith basically has to do with how we typically make excuses for ourselves, mostly by engaging in a kind of self-deceptive theater, and especially the kind of theater that would see our lives in terms of inescapable determinisms, as if we were objects simply responding passively to external forces. One place to glimpse bad faith of that sort in today's debate about free speech would be in the common talk about, quote, being triggered. This is an important example because it's often invoked as a reason to enslave everyone's speech so that someone doesn't get triggered because someone else isn't taking their ideological agenda seriously enough. Anyhow, as the metaphor of the trigger would suggest, we simply react to what other people say and do automatically, without any real autonomy or agency or say-so in the matter. We react like billiard balls on a pool table. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. Case closed. So if person X says Y, we have no choice but to react automatically by thinking, speaking, and behaving in way Z. And by the way, the same basic logic applies to most of today's common talk about outrage, too. It's really just another bad faith way of trying to claim that we're not free to decide what our emotional responses to things will be. But from Sartre's point of view, All of that is simply a self-serving fiction, a lie we tell ourselves and anyone else who will listen so that we can generate semi-plausible excuses for ourselves and thereby avoid having to assume responsibility for our lives. The whole logic of being triggered and outraged, and all of the enslavement of speech that would follow from it, is basically just a form of bad faith theater. A hollow, self-serving charade we perform, because from a Sartrean perspective, the distinctive nature of human existence is that we don't have the same kind of being that objects do. We're not like triggers or wooden puppets dancing on strings, and we never just react. Instead, our so-called reactions are always inescapably interwoven with our choices, most of which we make pre-reflectively about how we're going to feel and respond to whatever life is showing us. Consequently, no one ever really triggers us without at least our implicit consent. And the fact is that we're always free enough to choose some other response other than the one we're eager to claim is being triggered. And if it's a little hard to see how that's true, well, think about those times when you decide you're just not going to get outraged, even though someone is doing everything possible to trigger you. Think about those times when you decide you're just not going to play that dumbass game, and then ask yourself, what's keeping you from making a similar decision about your emotional responses in any other situation? And I'm guessing that if you ask that question deeply enough and honestly enough, the answer will be nothing. Nothing other than your own limiting beliefs, which are themselves the product of certain kinds of choices, specifically about what you're going to believe in and take seriously. Basically, there's simply no excuse for being triggered or outraged, no matter how much we want to believe otherwise. So, the upshot of Sartre's analysis for the topic of free speech is that part of the reason why we're so indifferent to the ongoing enslavement of our speech, along with the corresponding diminution of our opportunity to exist authentically, is that we just don't want to be free. That may not seem like a nice thing to say or hear, so let me say it again. We just don't want to be free, mostly because we don't want to be responsible for being free. In reality, it's much easier for most of us to behave like slaves and to continue generating excuses for our own enslavement, mostly because we just don't want to shoulder the burden of responsibility that real liberation always entails. As Stan Lee of Spider-Man fame used to say, with great power comes great responsibility, and that includes the power of free speech. But of course, when we become sufficiently liberated, and more importantly, sufficiently aware of our own liberation, it becomes difficult to take the whole ridiculous self-serving theater of bad faith seriously, whether in ourselves or in others. When we reach the end of our naive innocence, the theater of excuses loses its seductive charm. It's a terribly tragic moment. But the good news is that we gain something else in the process, because at that point we can begin to live like real adults in the real world, with a newfound opportunity to become the deep creators and artists of our own lives, free enough to think our own thoughts and speak our own minds and ultimately live our own unique possibilities in this life authentically and powerfully, which, if you think about it, is not bad compensation. However, I would also say that beyond the analyses of Heidegger and Sartre, Martin Buber's treatment of dialogical existentialism in I and Thou also deserves mention. Part of that's because Buber is explicitly taking up the question of how we address each other, which of course is a mode of speaking. Anyhow, according to Buber, there are two, quote, primary words, or ways of addressing another person. Either we treat another person like an it, like an object, and manipulate him or her according to the logic of utilitarian expediency, or we recognize the other person's deep humanity and address him or her as a sacred thou. So, the obvious question is, which of those two sounds more like the enslavement of speech, and which sounds more like free speech? And I think that the answer is fairly obvious, especially since enslaving our speech is mostly a way of trying to manipulate us, a way of trying to control our perceptions, values, and behaviors so that they align with someone's supposedly superior ideological agenda. Of course, for Buber, the alternative to that would be for us to learn to address each other as a thou, as the immeasurably deep and sacred beings that we are, which, unlike enslaved speech, really is a genuine path toward a better world. But to do that requires a measure of freedom from manipulation, from the safe, the predictable, and the appropriate. But of course, just because speech is free doesn't in itself mean that we're addressing each other as a thou. But that's not the point. The point is that without free speech, we have no real chance to do so in the first place. More importantly, all of this provides us with another clue about why we accept the enslavement of our speech so easily. It's partly because we've lost sight of what thou saying looks like and feels like, so much so that we no longer know what the deeper possibilities of our speech really are. Enslaved speech seems acceptable to us partly because we don't know what to do with free speech if we really had it, what free speech is actually for. So in that regard, we don't really know what we're losing when our speech is enslaved. Like the prisoners in Plato's cave, we're simply content with groping along in the darkness because we have no idea what experiencing the sunlight of free speech would actually feel like. And finally, in the previous video in this series, I said that we'd look at the connections between enslaved speech and addictive behavior. Of course, the first and most obvious connection is that addiction is itself a form of enslavement, a loss of the greater range of our human freedom. And as so often happens, addicts will usually fight tooth and nail against any genuine form of recovery, knowing full well that they're spiraling day by day into the abyss. And I would say that that's the same basic logic behind the enslavement of our speech. We accept both addiction and enslaved speech in our lives for very similar reasons. Basically, they're both expressions of the self-destructive impulse. The thanatos, or death drive, as Freud put it. Or, to cast it in the words of another, more recently famous Austrian, "It's in your nature to destroy yourselves." And part of the reason why it's so difficult to resist our self-destructive impulses, in all of their forms, is that it takes real decisiveness and real courage to do so. After all, in a way, it's always much less demanding just to let everything fall apart, just to follow the easy path of entropy as it undoes everything. Basically, to give up on caring about our freedom and about ourselves, especially in a world that constantly invites us to do so. And the unsettling fact is that there are always around 10,000 convincing excuses we can generate for letting ourselves fall into one state of enslavement or another, and really only one or two good reasons for living toward our fundamental freedom. So, at the end of the day, the question is, what are we going to let guide our lives? Which star in the night sky is the one by which we'll navigate life's trackless expanses of open ocean? It's a very interesting and very personal question that can demand a much greater level of honesty of us than usual. Okay, so at this point, let's move toward ending this video by summarizing its principal ideas. Again, the central question is, why are so many of us essentially indifferent to the ongoing regulation, control, and enslavement of our speech, especially since it's basically a way of bringing our perceptions, values, and behavior into alignment with other people's ideological agendas, which are probably not in our own interest at all? Of course, the answer to a question like that is bound to be complex and multifaceted. However, as we've seen, some of the more important factors have to do with 1. The fact that many of us simply aren't consciously aware that our speech is being enslaved by various interests that are trying very, very hard to manipulate and control us. 2. The fact that many of us are thoroughly entangled in the web of simple conformity and obedience, which is understandable since these are extremely powerful psychological forces in human affairs. 3. Our entanglement in conformity and obedience makes it very difficult for us to develop a sense for authenticity in our lives, which would otherwise help us resist the regulation of our speech according to other people's ideological agendas. 4. Since we have little sense for what authentic existence feels like, it's very difficult for us to avoid the pitfall of bad faith, which then means that we naturally avoid ever having to recognize and own our fundamental freedom and responsibility. Instead, we tend to fall into the tempting and exculpatory habit of continually making excuses for our lives and for everyone else's too. 5. Living in bad faith makes it practically impossible to address each other as a thou, an experience which would otherwise provide us with a deep and palpable reason to care about free speech, mostly by showing us what its true purpose and value are. And finally, 6. Without a sense for the experiential I-thou value of free speech, it's easy for us to stay continually mired in the self-destructive pathology of our addictive habits, which then turns enslaved speech into an addictive way of life, which, like any other addiction, is very difficult to break out of. So, I guess that aside from all of that, everything works out just fine. And by the way, that's sarcasm for those of you who didn't study as a second language in high school or college. Anyhow, at this point I would probably be remiss if I didn't end this video providing at least a few prescriptive suggestions about what we can do in our own lives to resist all of that. In my view, it basically boils down to two things, but they're two very difficult things. Obviously, I think that the first step is simply to do what we can to become more mindfully aware, so that we're able to perceive the various seductions of enslaved speech when they happen, as well as the importance of safeguarding our ability to speak freely. Developing our capacity for mindful awareness would also be necessary to recognizing how we're actually losing the authenticity of our lives when we allow our speech to become enslaved to other people's ideological agendas, as well as how easily we fall into the trap of bad faith. And those of you who've been watching my channel for a while can probably anticipate what I'm about to say next. In my own experience, the best way to develop that kind of mindful awareness is by practicing and developing meditative consciousness. That's because if we never learn to empty ourselves of all of the world's infuriating and titillating din, all of the myriad images and clamorous voices constantly vying for and enslaving our attention, we won't ever be able to perceive life's relative subtleties, such as the longing within our souls for real freedom, or the various forces that bind and restrict us and keep us smaller than we really need to be. So, step 1 is to do what we can to become more aware, more mindful, and more perceptive human beings. Step 2, which is very much related to step 1, is to develop the courage to be ourselves and consequently to express what we really are, whether it displeases other people or not. It's basically the courage to be unashamed of what we are, even if what we are contains faults and foibles of various sorts, which is inevitable. Of course, to be faithful to what we are, we also need to be able to perceive what we are, which in turn requires a certain level of mindful awareness. But it also requires something more than that. It requires the capacity to experience danger with fortitude, with intrepidity, because when we're truly being ourselves, we're always putting ourselves at risk, most especially in the form of inviting other people's ridicule, contempt, rejection, etc. So, developing the courage to be ourselves requires cultivating a certain relation to the sensation of danger, which of course can be a pretty daunting challenge. But I think that one idea that can help with that is to realize that it's inevitable that we'll be rejected, at least some fraction of the time, no matter what we do. For example, if we're being really nice and inoffensive, well, some people are inevitably going to hate that. If we're being too forward and provocative, some people are going to hate that too. And if we try to split the difference by occupying the middle ground between those extremes, well, some people will object to that too. And so it goes. No matter what, people are going to hate us, and despise us and reject us. Our lives will inevitably be filled with hate, no matter what we do and no matter how appropriate we attempt to be. There. Now do you feel better? Well, you might, because in a way it can be a liberating realization. Because if it's inevitable that we'll be hated, well, then we might as well just be ourselves, because there's no way we can escape hatred by trying to be something else. Anyhow, when we allow ourselves to be what we are, we're at least a little more immune from being manipulated by people who would play upon our sense of being ashamed of ourselves. And believe me, there are many people in this world who would love to see us manipulated, crippled, and controlled that way. And who knows? Maybe someday we'll even start to live authentically after all and give birth to a far better world in the process. So that's it. Just 2 things. All we really need to do to resist the enslavement of our speech is first to become mindfully aware of who and what we are, and equally aware of the various forces in this world that are trying to turn us into something else. And then we need to develop the courage to be what we are and to live our lives accordingly. That's it. Simple, isn't it? Well, it's simple to say, a little harder to do. But give it a try. See if it works for you. Anyhow, as always, thanks for watching. Peace out.